Chapter 5. The Tarmangani. During Stimble's absence from Camp, Blake had been occupied in dividing the food and equipment into 2 equal parts, which were arranged for Stimble's inspection and approval, but the division of the porters and askari he had left until the others' return, and was writing in his diary when the hunting party entered the camp. He could see at a glance that Stimble was in bad humor, but as that was the older man's usual state of temper, it caused Blake no particular anxiety, but rather gave him cause for added relief that on the morrow he would be rid of his ill-natured companion for good. Blake was more concerned, however, by the sullen demeanor of the askari who had accompanied Stimble, for it meant to the younger man that his companion had found some new occasion for bullying, abusing, or insulting them, and the difficulty of dividing the safari thus increased. Blake had felt from the moment that he had definitely reached the decision to separate from Stimble that one of the greatest obstacles they would have to overcome to carry out the plan would be to find sufficient men willing to submit themselves to Stimble's ideas of discipline, properly to transport his luggage and provisions and guard them and him. As Stimble passed and saw the 2 piles of equipment, the frown upon his face deepened. "I see you've got the stuff laid out," he remarked as he halted before Blake. "Yes, I wanted you to look it over and see that it is satisfactorily divided before I have it packed." "I don't want to be bothered with it," replied the other. "I know you wouldn't take any advantage of me on the division." "Thanks," replied Blake. "How about the niggers?" "That's not going to be so easy. You know you haven't treated them very well, and there will not be many of them anxious to return with you." "There's where you're dead wrong, Blake. The trouble with you is that you don't know anything about niggers. You're too easy with them. They haven't any respect for you, and the man they don't respect they don't like. They know that a fellow who beats EM is their master. And they know that a master is going to look after them. They wouldn't want to trust themselves on a long trek with you. You divided the junk. Now let me handle the niggers. That's more in my line, and I'll see that you get a square deal and a good, safe bunch. And I'll put the fear of God into EM so they won't dare be anything but loyal to you." "Just how do you propose selecting the men?" asked Blake. "Well, in the first place, I'd like you to have those men who may wish to accompany you. I'll grant there are few, so we'll just have EM all up, explain that we are separating, and I'll tell all those who wish to return with your safari to step forward. Then I'll choose some good men from what are left and make up enough that way to complete your quota. See? That's fair enough, isn't it?" "It's quite fair," agreed Blake. He was hoping that the plan would work out as easily as Stimble appeared to believe that it would, but he was far from believing, and so he thought it best to suggest an alternative that he was confident would have to be resorted to in the end. "In the event that one of us has difficulty in securing the requisite number of volunteers," he said, "I believe that we can enlist the necessary men by offering a bonus to be paid upon safe arrival at Railhead. If I am short of men, I shall be willing to do so." "Not a bad idea if you're afraid you can't hold EM together after I leave you," said Stimble. "It will be an added factor of safety for you too, but as for me, my men will live up to their original agreement, or there'll be some mighty sick niggers in these parts. What say we have them up and find out just how much of a job we've got on our hands?" He glanced about until his eyes fell on a headman. "Here, you," he called. "Come here and make it snappy." The black approached and stopped before the 2 white men. "You called me, Bwana?" he asked. "Gather up everyone in camp," directed Stimble. "Have them up here in 5 minutes for a palaver, every last man jack of them." "Yes, Bwana." As the headman withdrew, Stimble turned to Blake. "Any stranger in camp today?" he asked. "No, why?" "Ran across a wild man while I was hunting," replied Stimble. "He ordered me out of the jungle. What do you know about that?" And Stimble laughed. "A wild man?" "Yes, some crazy nut, I suppose. The niggers seem to know about him." "Who is he?" "Calls himself Tarzan." Blake elevated his brows. "Ah," he exclaimed, "you have met Tarzan of the Apes, and he has ordered you out of the jungle. You've heard of him?" "Certainly, and if he ever orders me out of his jungle, I'll go." "You would, but not Wilbur Stimble." "Why did he order you out?" asked Blake. "He just ordered me out, that's all. Wouldn't let me shoot a gorilla I'd been stalking. The fellow saved the gorilla from a python, killed the python, ordered me out of the jungle. Said he'd visit us in camp later and walked away with the gorilla like they were old pals. I never saw anything like it, but it doesn't make any difference to me who or what he thinks he is." I know who and what I am, and it's going to take more than a half-wit to scare me out of this country till I'm good and ready to go." "So you think Tarzan of the Apes is a half-wit?" "I think anyone's a half-wit who'd run about this jungle naked and unarmed." "You'll find he's not a half-wit, Stimble, and unless you want to get in more trouble than you ever imagined existed, you'll do just as Tarzan of the Apes tells you to do." "What do you know about him? Have you ever seen him?" "No," replied Blake. "But I have heard a lot about him from our men. He's as much a part of this locality as the jungle or the lions. Very few, if any, of our men have seen him, but he has the same hold upon their imaginations and superstitions as any of their demons. And they are even more fearful of incurring his displeasure. If they think Tarzan has it in for us, we're out of luck." "Well, all I've got to say is that if this monkey man knows when he's well off, he'll not come butting into the affairs of Wilbur Stimble." "And he's coming to visit us, is he?" said Blake. "Well, I certainly want to see him. I've heard of little else since we struck his country." "It's funny I never heard of him," said Stimble. "You never talk with the men," Blake reminded him. "Gad, it seems as though I'm doing nothing but talk to them," grumbled Stimble. "I said talk with them." "I don't chum with niggers," sneered Stimble. Blake grinned. "Here are the men," said Stimble. He turned toward the waiting porters, and Askari, and cleared his throat. "Mr. Blake and I are going to separate," he announced. "Everything has been divided. I am going to hunt a little farther to the west, make a circle toward the south, and return to the coast by a new route. I do not know what Mr. Blake's plans are, but he is going to get half the porters and half the Askari. And I want to tell you niggers right now that there isn't going to be any funny business about it. Half of you are going with Mr. Blake whether you like it or not." He paused impressively to let the full weight of his pronouncement sink home, as usual. He continued, "I wish to keep everyone contented and happy, so I'm going to give you who may want to go with Mr. Blake an opportunity to do so. Now listen, the packs over on that side are Mr. Blake's. Those on this side are mine. All those who are willing to accompany Mr. Blake go over on that side." There was a moment's hesitation upon the part of the men, and then some of them moved quietly over among Blake's packs. Others followed as their understanding slowly grasped the meaning of Stimble's words, until all of the men stood upon Blake's side. Stimble turned to Blake with a laugh and a shake of his head. "Gad," he exclaimed. "Did you ever see such a dumb bunch? No one could have explained the thing more simply than I, and yet look at them. Not one of them understood me." "Are you quite sure of that?" Stimble inquired Blake. Stimble did not immediately grasp the insinuation. When he did, he scowled. "Don't be a fool," he snapped. "Of course they misunderstood me." He turned angrily toward the men. "You thick-skulled, black idiots. Can't you understand anything?" He demanded. "I did not say that you all had to go with Mr. Blake, only those who wished to. Now the rest of you, those who wish to accompany me, get back over here on this side with my packs, and step lively." No one moved in the direction of Stimble's packs. The man flushed. "This is mutiny," he stormed. "Whoever is at the bottom of this is going to suffer. Come here, you," he motioned to a headman. "Who put you fellows up to this? Has Mr. Blake been telling you what to do?" "Don't be a fool," Stimble said Blake. "No one has influenced the men, and there is no mutiny. The plan was yours. The men have done just what you told them to. If it had not been for your insufferable egotism, you would have known precisely what the outcome would be. These black men are human beings. In some respects they are extremely sensitive human beings, and in many ways they are like children. You strike them, you curse them. You insult them, and they will fear you and hate you. You have done all these things to them, and they do fear you and hate you. You have sowed, and now you are reaping. I hope to God that it will teach you a lesson. There is just one way to get your men, and that is to offer them a big bonus. Are you willing to do that?" Stimble, his self-assurance momentarily shaken at last, wilted in the face of the realization that Blake was right. He looked about helplessly for a moment. The blacks, sullen-faced, stood there like dumb beasts, staring at him. In all those eyes there was no single friendly glance. He turned back to Blake. "See what you can do with them," he said. Blake faced the men. "It will be necessary for half of you to accompany Mr. Stimble back to the coast," he said. "He will pay double wages to all those who go with him, provided that you serve him loyally. Talk it over among yourselves and send word to us later by your headman. That is all. You may go." The balance of the afternoon passed, the two white men keeping to their respective tents, the blacks gathered in groups, whispering. Blake and Stimble no longer messed together, but after the evening meal each appeared with his pipe to await the report of the headmen. After half an hour Blake sent his boy to summon them, and presently they came and stood before the young man. "Well, have the men decided who will accompany Mr. Stimble?" he asked. "No one will accompany the old Bwana," replied their spokesman. "All will go with the young Bwana." "But Mr. Stimble will pay them well," Blake reminded, "and half of you must go with him." The black shook his head. "He could not make the pay big enough," he said. "No boy will go with him." "You agreed to come out with us and return with us," said Blake. "You must fulfill your agreement." "We agreed to come out with both of you and return with both of you. There was nothing said about returning separately. We will live up to our agreement, and the old Bwana may return in safety with the young Bwana." There was finality in the tone of the spokesman. Blake thought for a moment before replying. "You may go," he said. "I will talk with you again in the morning." The blacks had departed but a moment when the figure of a man appeared suddenly out of the darkness into the light of the campfire. "Oh, it's you, is it?" exclaimed Stimble. "Here's the wild man, Blake." The young American turned and surveyed the figure of the bronze giant who was standing just within the circle of the firelight. He noted the clean-cut features, the quiet dignity, the majestic mien, and smiled inwardly at recollection of Stimble's description of this godlike creature half-wit. "So you are Tarzan of the Apes," he said. Tarzan inclined his head. "And you?" he asked. "I am Jim Blake of New York," replied the American. "Hunting, of course." "With a camera." "Your companion was using a rifle," Tarzan reminded him. "I am not responsible for his acts. I cannot control them," replied Blake. "Nor anyone else," snapped Stimble. Tarzan permitted his gaze to move to Stimble for an instant, but ignored his boast. "I overheard the conversation between you and the headmen," he said, addressing Blake. "Some of your blacks had already told me something about your companion, and twice today I have had an opportunity to form an estimate of my own from personal observation, so I assume that you are separating because you cannot agree. Am I right?" "Yes," acknowledged Blake. "And after you separate, what are your plans?" "I intend to push in a little farther west and then swing," commenced Stimble. "I was speaking to Blake," interrupted Tarzan. "My plans concerning you are already made." "Well, who the—" "Silence," admonished the ape-man. "Go ahead, Blake." "We have not had much luck so far," replied Blake, "principally because we never can agree on methods. The result is that I have scarcely a single decent wild animal study. I had planned to go north away in search of lion pictures. I dislike going back without anything to show for the time and money I have put into the expedition. But now that the men have refused to accompany us separately, there is nothing for it but to return to the coast by the shortest route." "You two don't seem to be taking me into consideration at all," grumbled Stimble. "I've got as much money and time in this trip as Blake. You forget that I'm here to hunt, and what's more, I'm going to hunt, and I'm not going straight back to the coast by a damned sight, monkey man or no monkey man." Again Tarzan ignored Stimble. "Get ready to move out about an hour after sunrise," he said to Blake. "There will be no trouble about dividing the safari. I shall be here to attend to that and give you your final instructions," and as he spoke he turned and disappeared in the darkness. Chapter 6. Ara the Lightning. Before dawn the camp was astir, and by the appointed hour the packs were made and all was in readiness. The porters loitered, awaiting the word that would start the safari upon its eastward journey toward the coast. Blake and Stimble smoked in silence. The foliage of a nearby tree moved to the swaying of a branch, and Tarzan of the Apes dropped lightly into the camp. Exclamations of surprise broke from the lips of the Negroes, surprise clearly tinged with terror. The ape-man turned toward them and addressed them in their own dialect. "I am Tarzan of the Apes," he said, "Lord of the Jungle. You have brought white men into my country to kill my people. I am displeased. Those of you who wish to live to return to your villages and your families will listen well and do as Tarzan commands. You," he pointed at the chief headman, "shall accompany the younger white man whom I will permit to make pictures in my country where and when he will. Select half the men of the safari to accompany the young Bwana. And you," he addressed another headman, Take those men that remain and escort the older Bwana to Railhead in the most direct route and without delay. He is not permitted to hunt, and there will be no killing except for food or self-defense. Do not fail me. Remember always that Tarzan watches, and Tarzan never forgets." He turned then to the white men. "Blake," he said, "the arrangements are made. You may leave when you please with your own safari and go where you please. The question of hunting is left to your own discretion. You are the guest of Tarzan. And you," he addressed Stimble, "will be taken directly out of the country by the shortest route. You will be permitted to carry firearms for use in self-defense. If you abuse this permission, they will be taken away from you. Do not hunt. Even for food, your headman will attend to that." "Now just hold your horses," blustered Stimble. "If you think I'm going to put up with any such high-handed interference with my rights as an American citizen, you're very much mistaken. Why, I could buy and sell you and your damn jungle 40 times and not know that I'd spent a cent. For God's sake, Blake, tell this poor fool who I am before he gets himself into a lot of trouble." Tarzan turned to the headman he had selected for Stimble. "You may upload and march," he said. "If this white man does not follow you, leave him behind. Take good care of him if he obeys me, and deliver him safely at Railhead. Obey his orders if they do not conflict with those that I have given you. Go." A moment later, Stimble's safari was preparing to depart, and at Tarzan's request, Blake's too was moving out of camp. Stimble swore and threatened, but his men, sullenly ignoring him, filed off into the jungle toward the east. Tarzan had departed, swinging into the trees and disappearing among the foliage, and at last Stimble stood alone in the deserted camp. Thwarted, humiliated, almost frothing with rage, he ran after his men, screaming commands and threats that were ignored. Later in the day, sullen and silent, he marched near the head of the long file of porters and askari, convinced at last that the power of the ape-man was greater than his, but in his heart burned resentment, and in his mind rioted plans for vengeance, plans that he knew were futile. Tarzan, wishing to assure himself that his instructions were being carried out, had swung far ahead and was waiting in the crotch of a tree that overhung the trail along which Stimble must pass. In the distance he could hear the sounds that arose from the marching safari. Along the trail from the opposite direction something was approaching. The ape-man could not see it, but he knew what it was. Above the treetops black clouds rolled low, but no air stirred in the jungle. Along the trail came a great, shaggy, black man thing. Tarzan of the Apes hailed it as it came in sight of his arboreal perch. "Bolgani," he called in low tones. The gorilla stopped. He stood erect upon his hind feet and looked about. "I am Tarzan," said the ape-man. Bolgani grunted. "I am Bolgani," he replied. "The Tarmangani comes," warned Tarzan. "I kill," growled Bolgani. "Let the Tarmangani pass," said Tarzan. "He and his people have many thunder sticks. I have sent this Tarmangani out of the jungle. Let him pass. Go a little way from the trail. The stupid Gomangani and the Tarmangani, who is stupider, will pass by without knowing that Tarzan and Bolgani are near." From the darkening sky distant thunder boomed, and the two beasts looked upward toward the broad field of nature's powers, more savage and destructive than their own. "Pan, the thunder hunts in the sky," remarked the ape-man. "Hunts for Yusha the wind," said Bolgani. Presently we shall hear Yusha fleeing through the trees to escape. Tarzan viewed the lowering black clouds. Even Kudu the sun fears Pan, hiding his face when Pan hunts. Ara the lightning shot through the sky. To the two beasts it was a bolt from Pan's bow, and the great drops of rain that commenced to fall shortly after was Mita, the blood of Yusha the wind, pouring from many a wound. The jungle bent to a great pressure, but as yet there was no other noise than the rolling thunder. The trees whipped back and Yusha tore through the forest. The darkness increased. The rain fell in great masses. Leaves and branches hurtled through the air. Trees crashed amongst their fellows. With deafening roars the elements unleashed their pent anger. The beasts cowered beneath the one awe-inspiring power that they acknowledged as supreme. Tarzan crouched in the crotch of a great tree with his shoulders arched against the beating rain. Just off the trail Bolgani squatted in drenched and bedraggled misery. They waited. There was nothing else that they could do. Above them the storm broke again with maniacal fury. The thunder crashed with deafening reverberation. There was a blinding flash of light, and the branch upon which Tarzan squatted sagged and hurtled to the trail beneath. Stunned, the ape-man lay where he had fallen, the great branch partially across his body. As quickly as it had come, the storm departed. Kudu the sun burst through the clouds. Bolgani, dejected and still terrified, remained where he had squatted, motionless and silent. Bolgani had no desire to attract the attention of Pan the Thunder. Soaked with water, cold, furious, Stimble slopped along the slippery, muddy trail. He did not know that his safari was some little distance behind him, for he had forged ahead during the storm while they had taken refuge beneath the trees. At a turn in the trail he came suddenly upon a fallen branch that blocked the way. At first he did not see the body of the man lying beneath it, but when he did he recognized it instantly, and a new hope sprang to life within his breast. With Tarzan dead, he could be free to do as he pleased, but was the ape-man dead? Stimble ran forward and, kneeling, placed an ear to the breast of the prostrate figure. An expression of disappointment crossed his face. Tarzan was not dead. The expression upon Stimble's face changed. A cunning look came into his eyes as he glanced back down the trail. His men were not in sight. He looked quickly about him. He was alone with the unconscious author of his humiliation. He thought he was alone. He did not see the shaggy figure that had silently arisen as the sound of Stimble's approach had come to its sensitive ears, and was now peering at him through the foliage, peering at him, and at the silent figure of the ape-man. Stimble drew his hunting knife from its scabbard. He could slip its point into the wild man's heart and run back down the trail. His men would find him waiting for them. Later they would come upon the dead Tarzan, but they would not guess how he had met his end. The ape-man moved. Consciousness was returning. Stimble realized that he must act quickly, and at the same instant a great hairy arm reached out through the foliage and a mighty hand closed upon his shoulder. With a screaming curse he turned to look into the hideous face of Bolgani. He tried to strike at the shaggy breast of his antagonist with his hunting knife, but the puny weapon was torn from his grasp and hurled into the bushes. The great yellow fangs were bared against Stimble's throat as Tarzan opened his eyes. "Krieg, ah!" cried the ape-man in warning. Bolgani paused and looked at his fellow beast. "Let him go," said Tarzan. "The Tarmangani would have killed Tarzan," explained the gorilla. Bolgani stopped him. "Bolgani kill," he growled horribly. "No," snapped Tarzan. "Free the Tarmangani." The gorilla released his grasp upon Stimble just as the first of the hunter's men came in sight of them, and as Bolgani saw the blacks and how numerous they were, his nervousness and irritability increased. "Take to the jungle," Bolgani said. Tarzan will take care of this Tarmangani and the Gomangani." With a parting growl the gorilla merged with the foliage and the shadows of the jungle as Tarzan of the Apes faced Stimble and his boys. "You had a close call then," Stimble said, the ape-man. "It is fortunate for you that you didn't succeed in killing me. I was here for two reasons. One was to see that you obeyed my instructions, and the other to protect you from your men. I did not like the way they eyed you in camp this morning. It would not be a difficult thing to lose you in the jungle, and that would put a period to you as surely as poison or a knife. I felt a certain responsibility for you because you are a white man, but you have just now released me from whatever obligation racial ties may have influenced me to acknowledge. I shall not kill you, Stimble, as you deserve, but from now on you may reach the coast on your own, and you will doubtless discover that one cannot make too many friends in the jungle or afford a single unnecessary enemy." He wheeled upon Stimble's black boys. "Tarzan of the Apes goes his way. You will not see him again, perhaps. Do your duty by this white man as long as he obeys the word of Tarzan, but see that he does not hunt." With this final admonition the ape-man swung into the lower branches and was gone. When Stimble, after repeatedly questioning his men, discovered that Tarzan had practically assured them that they would see no more of him, he regained much of his former assurance and egotistical bluster. Once more he was the leader of men, shouting at the blacks in a loud tone, cursing them, ridiculing them. He thought that it impressed them with his greatness. He believed that they were simple people whom he could deceive into thinking that he was not afraid of Tarzan, and by flaunting Tarzan's commands win their respect. Now that Tarzan had promised not to return, Stimble felt safer in ignoring his wishes, and so it befell that just before they reached a camping ground, Stimble came upon an antelope, and without an instant's hesitation fired and killed it. It was a sullen camp that Stimble made that night. The men gathered in groups and whispered, "He has shot an antelope and Tarzan will be angry with us," said one. "He will punish us," said a headman. "The Bwana is a bad man," said another. "I wish he was dead." "We may not kill him. Tarzan has said that. If we leave him in the jungle, he will die. Tarzan told us to do our duty." He said to do it as long as the bad Bwana obeyed the commands of Tarzan. He has disobeyed them. Then we may leave him. Stimble, exhausted by the long march, slept like a log. When he awoke, the sun was high. He shouted for his boy. There was no response. Again he shouted, and louder, adding an oath. No one came. There was no sound in camp. The lazy niggers, he grumbled. They'll step a little livelier when I get out there. He arose and dressed, but as he was dressing, the silence of the camp came to impress him as something almost menacing, so that he hastened to be through and out of the tent. As he stepped into the open, the truth was revealed at almost the first quick glance about. Not a human being was in sight, and all but one of the packs containing provisions were gone. He had been deserted in the heart of Africa. His first impulse was to seize his rifle and start after the blacks. But second thought impressed him with the danger of such procedure and convinced him that the last thing he should do would be to place himself again in the power of these men who had demonstrated that they felt no compunction in abandoning him to almost certain death. If they wanted to be rid of him, they could easily find even a quicker means if he returned and forced himself upon them again. There was but a single alternative, and that was to find Blake and remain with him. He knew that Blake would not abandon him to death in the jungle. The blacks had not left him without provisions, nor had they taken his rifle or ammunition, but the difficulty that now confronted Stimble was largely in the matter of transportation for his food. There was plenty of it to last many days, but he knew that he could not carry it through the jungle together with his rifle and ammunition. To remain where the food was would be equally futile. Blake was returning to the coast by another route. The ape-man had said that he would not follow Stimble's safari farther. It might be years, therefore, before another human being chanced along this little-used game trail. He knew that he and Blake were now separated by about 2 marches, and if he traveled light and Blake did not march too rapidly, he might hope to overtake him inside a week. Perhaps Blake would find good camera hunting soon and make a permanent camp. In that case, Stimble would find him even more quickly. He felt better when he had definitely decided upon a plan of action, and after a good breakfast he made up a small pack of provisions, enough to last him a week, filled his belts and pockets with ammunition, and started off along the back trail. It was easy going, for the trail of the day before was plain, and this was the 3rd time that Stimble had been over it, so he had no difficulty in reaching the camp at which he and Blake had parted company. As he entered the little clearing early in the afternoon, he determined to keep on and cover as much ground on Blake's trail as he could before dark, but for a few minutes he would rest. As he sat down with his back against the bole of a tree, he did not notice a movement of the tops of a clump of jungle grasses a few yards distant, and if he had, he would, doubtless, have attached no importance to the matter. Finishing a cigarette, Stimble arose, rearranged his pack, and started off in the direction Blake's men had taken early the preceding morning. But he had covered but a yard or two when he was brought to a sudden halt by an ominous growl that arose from a little clump of jungle grasses close in front of him. Almost simultaneously the fringing grasses parted, and there appeared in the opening the head of a great black maned lion. With a scream of fear, Stimble dropped his pack, threw aside his rifle, and started on a run for the tree beneath which he had been sitting. The lion, itself somewhat surprised, stood for an instant watching him, and then started in pursuit at an easy lope. Stimble, casting an affrighted glance rearward, was horrified. The lion seemed so close and the tree so far away. If distance lends enchantment to the view, proximity may also at times have its advantage. In this instance it served to accelerate the speed of the fleeing man to a most surprising degree, and though he was no longer young, he clawed his way to the lower branches of the tree with speed, if not with grace, that would have done justice to a trained athlete. Nor was he an instant too speedy. Numa's raking talons touched his boot and sent him swarming up among the higher branches, where he clung weak and panting, looking down into the snarling visage of the carnivore. For a moment Numa growled up at him, and then, with a coughing grunt, turned away and strode majestically in the direction of the clump of grasses from which he had emerged. He stopped to sniff at the pack of provisions Stimble had discarded, and, evidently piqued by the man's scent clinging to it, cuffed at it angrily. It rolled to one side and Numa stepped back, eyeing it warily. Then, with a growl, he leaped upon it and commenced to maul the insensate thing, ripping and tearing until its contents were scattered about upon the ground. He bit into tins and boxes until scarcely an article remained intact, while Stimble crouched in the tree and watched the destruction of his provisions, utterly helpless to interfere. A dozen times he cursed himself for having thrown away his rifle, and even more frequently he vowed vengeance. He consoled himself, however, with the realization that Blake could not be far away and that with Blake there were ample provisions which could be augmented by trading and hunting. When the lion left, he would descend and follow Blake's trail. Numa, tired of the contents of the pack, resumed his way toward the long grass, but again his attention was distracted this time by the thunder stick of the Tarmangani. The lion smelled of the discarded rifle, pawed it, and finally picked it up between his jaws. Stimble looked on, horrified. What if the beast damaged the weapon? He would be left without means of defense or for obtaining food. "Drop it," shouted Stimble. "Drop it." Numa, ignoring the ravings of the despised man-thing, strode into his lair, carrying the rifle with him. That afternoon and night spelled an eternity of terror for Wilbur Stimble. While daylight lasted, the lion remained in the nearby patch of grass, effectually deterring the unhappy man from continuing his search for Blake's camp. And after night fell, no urge whatever could have induced Stimble to descend to the paralyzing terrors of the jungle night, even had he known that the lion had departed, and no sounds had apprised him of the near presence of danger, but sounds did apprise him. From shortly after dark until nearly dawn, a perfect bedlam of howls and growls and coughs and grunts and barks arose from directly beneath him, as there had been held a convention of all the horrid beasts of the jungle at the foot of the tree that seemed at best an extremely insecure sanctuary. When morning came, the jungle lay silent and peaceful about him, and only torn canvas and empty cans bore mute evidence to the feast of the hyenas that had passed into jungle history. Numa had departed, leaving the remains of the kill upon which he had lain as the piece de resistance of the hyenian banquet, for which Stimble had furnished the hors d'oeuvres. Stimble, trembling, descended. Through the jungle, wild-eyed, startled by every sound, scurried a pitiful figure of broken, terror-stricken old age. Few could have recognized in it Wilbur Stimble of Stimble Company, Brokers, New York. Chapter 7. The Cross. The storm that had overtaken Stimble's safari wrought even greater havoc with the plans of Jim Blake, altering in the instant of a single blinding flash of lightning the course of his entire life. Accompanied by a single black, who carried his camera and an extra rifle, Blake had struck out from the direct route of his safari in search of lion pictures, there being every indication that the great carnivores might be found in abundance in the district through which they were passing. It was his intention to parallel the route of his main body and rejoin it in camp in the afternoon. The boy who accompanied him was intelligent and resourceful. The direction and speed of the marching safari were mutually agreed upon, and the responsibility for bringing Blake into camp safely was left entirely to the Negro. Having every confidence in the boy, Blake gave no heed to either time or direction, devoting all his energies to the fascinating occupation of searching for photographic studies. Shortly after leaving the safari, Blake and his companion encountered a herd of 7 or 8 lions, which included a magnificent old male, an old lioness, and 5 or 6 young, ranging from half to full grown. At sight of Blake and his companion, the lions took off leisurely through rather open forest, and the men followed, awaiting patiently the happy coincidence of time, light, and grouping that would give the white man such a picture as he desired. In the mind of the black man was pictured the route of the safari and its relation to the meanderings of the quarry. He knew how far and in what directions he and his companion were being led from their destination. To have returned to the trail of the safari would have been a simple matter to him, but Blake, depending entirely upon the black, gave no heed either to time or direction. For 2 hours they clung doggedly to the spoor, encouraged by occasional glimpses of now one, now several members of the regal group, but never was the opportunity afforded for a successful shot. Then the sky became rapidly overcast by black clouds, and a few moments later the storm broke in all the terrific fury that only an equatorial storm can achieve, and an instant later, amidst the deafening roar of thunder and a blinding flash of lightning, utter disaster engulfed James Hunter Blake. How long he lay, stunned by the shock of the bolt that had struck but a few feet from him, he did not know. When he opened his eyes, the storm had passed, and the sun was shining brightly through the leafy canopy of the forest. Still dazed, uncomprehending the cause or extent of the catastrophe, he raised himself slowly upon an elbow and looked about him. One of the first sights that met his eyes aided materially in the rapid recovery of his senses. Less than 100 feet from him stood a group of lions, 7 of them solemnly regarding him. The characteristics of individual lions differ as greatly from those of their fellows as do the characteristics of individuals of the human race, and even as a human being, a lion may have his moods as well as his personal idiosyncrasies. These lions that gravely inspected the man-thing had been spared any considerable experience with the human species they had seen, but few men, they had never been hunted, they were well-fed. Blake had done nothing greatly to upset their easily irritated nervous systems. Fortunately for him, they were merely curious. But Blake did not know all this. He knew only that 7 lions were standing within 100 feet of him, that they were not in a cage, and that while he had pursued them to obtain photographs, the thing that he most desired at the moment was not his camera but his rifle. Stealthily, that he might not annoy them, he looked about him for the weapon. To his consternation, it was nowhere in sight, nor was his gun-bearer with the extra rifle. Where could the boy be? Doubtless frightened by the lions, he had decamped. 20 feet away was a most inviting tree. Blake wondered if the lions would charge the moment that he rose to his feet. He tried to remember all that he had heard about lions, and he did recall one fact that applies with almost axiomatic verity to all dangerous animals: if you run from them, they will pursue you. To reach the tree, it would be necessary to walk almost directly toward the lions. Blake was in a quandary, and then one of the younger lions moved a few steps nearer. That settled the matter as far as Blake was concerned, for the closer the lions came, the shorter his chance of gaining the tree ahead of them in the event that they elected to prevent. In the midst of a tremendous forest, entirely surrounded by trees, nature had chosen to strike him down almost in the center of a natural clearing. There was a good tree 100 feet away and on the opposite side of the clearing from the lions. Blake stole a longing glance at it and then achieved some rapid mental calculations. If he ran for the farther tree, the lions would have to cover 200 feet while he was covering 100, while if he chose the nearer tree, they must come 80 feet while he was going 20. There seemed therefore no doubt as to the greater desirability of the nearer tree, which ruled favorite by odds of 2 to 1. Against it, however, loomed the mental hazard that running straight into the face of 7 lions involved. Jim Blake was sincerely, genuinely and honestly scared, but unless the lions were psychoanalysts, they would never have dreamed the truth, as he started nonchalantly and slowly toward them in the tree. The most difficult feat that he had ever accomplished lay in making his legs behave themselves. They wanted to run, so did his feet and his heart and his brain, only his will held them in leash. Those were tense moments for Jim Blake. The first half-dozen steps he took with 7 great lions watching his approach. He saw that they were becoming nervous. The lioness moved uneasily. The old male growled. A younger male, he who had started forward, lashed his sides with his tail, flattened his head, bared his fangs, and stealthily approached. Blake was almost at the tree when something happened. He never knew what the cause, but inexplicably the lioness turned and bounded away, voicing a low whine, and after her went the other 6. The man leaned against the bole of the tree and fanned himself with his helmet. "Whew," he breathed. "I hope the next lion I see is in the Central Park Zoo." But even lions were forgotten in the developments that the next few moments revealed after repeated shouts, for the black boy had brought no response, and Blake had determined that he must set out in search of him. Nor did he have far to go. On the back track, just inside the clearing, Blake found a few remnants of charred flesh and a blackened and half-molten rifle barrel. Of the camera, not a vestige remained. The bolt that had bowled Blake over must have squarely struck his gun-bearer, killing him instantly, exploding all the ammunition, destroying the camera and ruining the rifle that he had carried. But what had become of the rifle that had been in Blake's hands? The man searched in all directions but could not find it, and was finally forced to the conclusion that its disappearance could be attributed only to one of those freakish tricks which severe electrical storms so often play upon helpless and futile humanity. Frankly aware that he was lost, and had not the faintest conception of the direction in which lay the proposed camp of his safari, Blake started blindly off on what he devoutly hoped would prove the right route. It was not. His safari was moving northeast. Blake headed north. For 2 days he trudged on through dense forest, sleeping at night among the branches of trees. Once his fitful slumbers were disturbed by the swaying of a branch against which he was braced. As he awoke, he felt it sag as to the weight of some large animal. He looked and saw 2 fiery eyes gleaming in the dark. Blake knew it to be a leopard as he drew his automatic and fired point blank. With a hideous scream, the great cat sprang or fell to the ground. Blake never knew if he hit it. It did not return, and there were no signs of it in the morning. He found food and water in abundance, and upon the morning of the 3rd day he emerged from the forest at the foot of a range of lofty mountains, and for the first time in weeks reveled in an unobstructed view of the blue sky, and saw the horizon again, and all that lay between himself and it. He had not realized that he had been depressed by the darkness and the crowding pressure of the trees, but now he experienced all the spiritual buoyancy of a released convict long immured from freedom and the light of day. Rescue was no longer problematical, merely a matter of time. He wanted to sing and shout, but he conserved his energies and started toward the mountains. There had been no native villages in the forest, and so, he reasoned, as there must be native villages in a well-watered country stocked with game, he would find them upon the mountain slopes. Topping a rise, he saw below him the mouth of a canyon, in the bed of which ran a small stream. A village would be built on water. If he followed the water, he would come to the village. Quite easy. He descended to the stream, where he was deeply gratified to find that a well-worn path paralleled it. Encouraged by the belief that he would soon encounter natives and believing that he would have no difficulty in enlisting their services in aiding him to relocate his safari, Blake followed the path upward into the canyon. He had covered something like 3 miles without having discovered any sign of habitation when at a turn in the path he found himself at the foot of a great white cross of enormous proportions. Hewn from limestone, it stood directly in the center of the trail and towered above him fully 60 feet. Checked and weather-worn, it gave an impression of great antiquity, which was further borne out by the remains of an almost obliterated inscription upon the face of its massive base. Blake examined the carved letters but could not decipher their message. The characters appeared of early English origin, but he dismissed such a possibility as too ridiculous to entertain. He knew that he could not be far from the southern boundary of Abyssinia, and that the Abyssinians are Christians. Thus he explained the presence of the cross, but he could not explain the suggestion of sinister menace that this lonely, ancient symbol of the crucifix held for him. Why was it? What was it? Standing there, tongueless, hoary with age, it seemed to call upon him to stop, to venture not beyond it into the unknown. It warned him back, but not, seemingly, out of a spirit of kindliness and protection, but rather with arrogance and hate. With a laugh, Blake threw off the mood that had seized him and went on, but as he passed the great white monolith he crossed himself, though he was not a Catholic. He wondered what had impelled him to the unfamiliar act, but he could no more explain it than he could the strange and uncanny suggestion of power and personality that seemed to surround the crumbling cross. Another turn in the path, and the trail narrowed where it passed between 2 huge boulders that might have fallen from the cliff top towering far above, cliffs closed in closely now in front and upon 2 sides. Apparently he was close to the canyon's head, and yet there was no slightest indication of a village. Yet where did the trail lead? It had an end and a purpose. He would discover the former and, if possible, the latter. Still under the depressing influence of the cross, Blake passed between the 2 boulders, and the instant that he had passed them a man stepped out behind him, and another in front. They were Negroes, stalwart, fine-featured fellows, and in themselves nothing to arouse wonder or surprise. Blake had expected to meet Negroes in Africa, but not Negroes wearing elaborately decorated leathern jerkins upon the breasts of which red crosses were emblazoned, close-fitting nether garments and sandals held by duskin thongs, cross-gartered halfway to their knees. Not Negroes wearing close-fitting bassinets of leopard skin that fitted their heads closely and reached to below their ears, not Negroes armed with 2-handed broadswords and elaborately tipped pikes. Blake was acutely aware of the pike tips, as there was one pressing against his belly and another in the small of his back. "Who be ye?" demanded the Negro that faced Blake. Had the man addressed him in Greek, Blake would have been no more surprised than he was by the incongruity of this archaic form of speech falling from the lips of a 20th century Central African black. He was too dumbfounded for an instant to reply. "Doubtless the fellow be a Saracen," Paul said, the black behind Blake, "and understands not what thou sayest, a spy perchance." "Nay, Peter Wiggs, as my name be Paul Bodkin, he be no infidel that I know of mine own good eyes. Whatsoe'er he be, it is for ye to fetch him before the captain of the gate, who will question him, Paul Bodkin. Natheless there be no hurt in questioning him first, and he will answer." "Stop thy tongue and take him to the captain," said Peter. "I will abide here and guard the way until thou returnest." Paul stepped aside and motioned for Blake to precede him. Then he fell in behind, and the American did not need to glance back to know that the ornate tip of the pike was ever threateningly ready. The way lay plain before him, and Blake followed the trail toward the cliffs, where there presently appeared the black mouth of a tunnel leading straight into the rocky escarpment. Leaning against the sides of a niche just within the entrance were several torches made of reeds or twigs bound tightly together and dipped in pitch. One of these Polbodkin selected took some tinder from a metal box he carried in a pouch at his side, struck a spark to it with flint and steel, and having thus ignited the tinder and lighted the torch, he pushed Blake on again with the tip of his pike, and the two entered the tunnel, which the American found to be narrow and winding, well suited to defense. Its floor was worn smooth until the stones of which it was composed shone polished in the flaring of the torch. The sides and roof were black with the soot of countless thousands, perhaps of torch-lighted passages along this strange way that led to what? Chapter 8. The Snake Strikes. Unversed in jungle craft, overwhelmed by the enormity of the catastrophe that had engulfed him, his reasoning faculties numbed by terror, Wilbur Stimble slunk through the jungle, the fleeing quarry of every terror that imagination could conjure. Matted filth caked the tattered remnants of his clothing that scarce covered the filth of his emaciated body. His once graying hair had turned to white, matching the white stubble of a 4 days' beard. He followed a broad and well-marked trail along which men and horses, sheep and goats had passed within the week, and with the blindness and ignorance of the city dweller he thought that he was on the spoor of Blake's safari. Thus it came that he stumbled, exhausted, into the menzil of the slow-moving Ibn Jad. Fijuan, the galley slave, discovered him and took him at once to the Sheikh's Beit, where Ibn Jad, with his brother, Tolog, and several others, were squatting in the muqad sipping coffee. Bayullah, what strange creature hast thou captured now? Fijuan demanded the sheikh. Perhaps a holy man, replied the black, for he is very poor and without weapons and very dirty. Yes, surely he must be a very holy man. Who art thou? Demanded Ibn Jad. I am lost and starving. Give me food, begged Stimble. But neither understood the language of the other. Another Nazrani, said Fadi contemptuously. A Frenchie, perhaps. He looks more like one of El Ingley's, remarked Tolog. Perhaps he is from France, suggested Ibn Jad. Speak to him that vile tongue, Fadi, which thou didst come by among the soldiers in Algeria. Who are you, stranger? Demanded Fadi in French. I am an American, replied Stimble, relieved and delighted to have discovered a medium of communication with the Arabs. I have been lost in the jungle and I am starving. He is from the New World and he has been lost and is starving, translated Fadi. Ibn Jad directed that food be brought, and as the stranger ate they carried on a conversation through Fadi. Stimble explained that his men had deserted him and that he would pay well to be taken to the coast. The Bedouin had no desire to be further hampered by the presence of a weak old man, and was inclined to have Stimble's throat slit as the easiest solution of the problem, but Fadi, who was impressed by the man's boastings of his great wealth, saw the possibilities of a large reward or ransom and prevailed upon the sheikh to permit Stimble to remain among them for a time at least, promising to take him into his own bait and be responsible for him. Ibn Jad would have slain you, Nasrani, said Fad to Stimble later, but Fadi saved you. Remember that when the time comes for distributing the reward, and remember, too, that Ibn Jad will be as ready to kill you tomorrow as he was today, and that always your life is in the hands of Fad. What is it worth? I will make you rich, replied Stimble. During the days that followed, Fadi and Stimble became much better acquainted, and with returning strength and a feeling of security, Stimble's old boastfulness returned. He succeeded in impressing the young Bedouin with his vast wealth and importance, and so lavish were his promises that Fadi soon commenced to see before him a life of luxury, ease, and power. But with growing cupidity and ambition developed an increasing fear that someone might wrest his good fortune from him. Ibn Jad being the most logical and powerful competitor for the favors of the Nazrani, Fad lost no opportunity to impress upon Stimble that the sheikh was still thirsting for his blood, though, as a matter of fact, Ibn Jad was so little concerned over the affairs of Wilbur Stimble that he would have forgotten his presence entirely were he not occasionally reminded of it by seeing the man upon the march or about the camps. One thing, however, that Fadi accomplished was to acquaint Stimble with the fact that there was dissension and treachery in the ranks of the Bedouins, and this he determined to use to his own advantage should necessity demand. And ever, though slowly, the Arab drew closer to the fabled leopard city of Nimr, and as they marched, Said found opportunity to forward his suit for the hand of Atija, the daughter of Sheikh Ibn Jad, while Tolog sought by insinuation to advance the claims of Fad in the eyes of the sheikh. This he did always, and only when Fad might hear, as in reality his only wish was to impress upon the young traitor the depth of the latter's obligation to him, When Tolog should become sheikh, he would not care who won the hand of Atija. But Fahd was not satisfied with the progress that was being made. Jealousy rode him to distraction until he could not look upon Zaid without thoughts of murder seizing his mind. At last they obsessed him. He schemed continually to rid himself and the world of his more successful rival. He spied upon him and upon Atija, and at last a plan unfolded itself with opportunity treading upon its heels. Fahd had noticed that nightly Zaid absented himself from the gatherings of the men in the muqa'ad of the sheikh's tent, and that when the simple household duties were performed, Atija slipped out into the night. Fahd followed and confirmed what was really too apparent to be dignified by the name of suspicion. Zaid and Atija met. And then one night Fahd was not at the meeting in the sheikh's bait. Instead he hid near the tent of Zaid, and when the latter had left to keep his tryst, Fahd crept in and seized the matchlock of his rival. It was already loaded and he had but to prime it with powder. Stealthily he crept by back ways through the camp to where Zaid awaited his light of love and sneaked up behind him. At a little distance, sitting in his muqa'ad with his friends beneath the light of paper lanterns, Ibn Jad the sheikh was plainly visible to the two young men standing in the outer darkness. Atija was still in the women's quarters. Fahd, standing behind Zaid, raised the ancient matchlock to his shoulder and aimed very carefully. He aimed, but not at Zaid. No, for the cunning of Fahd was as the cunning of the fox. Had Zaid been murdered, naught could ever convince Atija that Fahd was not the murderer. Fahd knew that, and he was equally sure that Atija would have naught of the slayer of her lover. Beyond Zaid was Ibn Jad, but Fahd was not aiming at Ibn Jad either. At whom was he aiming? No one. Not yet was the time ripe to slay the sheikh. First must they have their hands upon the treasure, the secret of which he alone was supposed to hold. Fahd aimed at one of the amdan of the sheikh's tent. He aimed with great care and then he pulled the trigger. The prop splintered and broke a foot above the level of Ibn Jad's head, and simultaneously Fahd threw down the musket and leaped upon the startled Zaid, at the same time crying loudly for help. Startled by the shot and the cries, men ran from all directions, and with them was the sheikh. He found Zaid being held tightly from behind by Fahd. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded Ibn Jad. "By Eula, Ibn Jad, he would have slain thee," cried Fahd. "I came upon him just in time, and as he fired I leaped upon his back, else he would have killed you." "He lies," cried Zaid. "The shot came from behind me. If any fired upon Ibn Jad, it was Fahd himself." Atija, wide-eyed, ran to her lover. "Thou didst not do it, Zaid. Tell me that thou didst not do it." "As Allah is my God and Muhammad his prophet, I did not do it," swore Zaid. "I would not have thought it of him," said Ibn Jad. Cunning, Fahd did not mention the matchlock. Shrewdly he guessed that its evidence would be more potent if discovered by another than he, and that it would be discovered, he was sure. Nor was he wrong. Tolog found it. "Here," he exclaimed, "is the weapon." "Let us examine it beneath the light," said Ibn Jad. "It should dispel our doubts more surely than any lying tongue." As the party moved in the direction of the sheikh's bait, Zaid experienced the relief of one reprieved from death, for he knew that the testimony of the matchlock would exonerate him. It could not be his. He pressed the hand of Atija, walking at his side. Beneath the light of the paper lanterns in the muqa'ad, Ibn Jad held the weapon beneath his gaze as, with craning necks, the others pressed about him. A single glance sufficed. With stern visage the sheikh raised his eyes. "It is Zaid's," he said. Atija gasped and drew away from her lover. "I did not do it. It is some trick," cried Zaid. "Take him away," commanded Ibn Jad. "See that he is tightly bound." Atija rushed to her father and fell upon her knees. "Do not slay him," she cried. "It could not have been he. I know it was not he." "Silence, girl," commanded the sheikh sternly. "Go to thy quarters and remain there." They took Zaid to his own bait and bound him securely, and in the muqa'ad of the sheikh the elders sat in judgment, while from behind the curtains of the women's quarters, Atija listened. "At dawn then he shall be shot." This was the sentence that Atija heard passed upon her lover. Behind his greasy thorib Fahd smiled a crooked smile. In his black house of hair Zaid struggled with the bonds that held him, for though he had not heard the sentence he was aware of what his fate would be. In the quarters of the harem of the Sheikh Ibn Jad, the sheikh's daughter lay sleepless and suffering. Her long lashes were wet with tears, but her grief was silent. Wide-eyed she waited, listening, and presently her patience was rewarded by the sounds of the deep, regular breathing of Ibn Jad and his wife Herfa. They slept. Atija stirred. Stealthily she raised the lower edge of the tent cloth beside which lay her sleeping mat and rolled quietly beneath it into the muqayyad, now deserted. Groping, she found the matchlock of Zaid where Ibn Jad had left it. She carried also a bundle wrapped in an old torib, the contents of which she had gathered earlier in the evening when Herfa, occupied with her duties, had been temporarily absent from the women's quarters. Atija emerged from the tent of her father and crept cautiously along the single, irregular street formed by the pitched tents of the Arab until she came to the beat of Zaid. For a moment she paused at the opening, listening, then she entered softly on sandaled feet. But Zaid, sleepless, struggling with his bonds, heard her. "Who comes?" he demanded. "SSS," cautioned the girl. "It is I, Atija." She crept to his side. "Beloved," he murmured. Deftly the girl cut the bonds that held his wrists and ankles. "I have brought thee food and thy musket," she told him. "These and freedom I give thee, the rest thou must do thyself. Thy mare stands tethered with the others. Far is the Beled el-Guad, beset with dangers is the way, but night and day will Atija pray to Allah to guide thee safely. Haste, my loved one." Zaid pressed her tightly to his breast, kissed her, and was gone into the night.